Late at night on September 26, 1983, the fate of the world hung by a thread, and almost no one knew it. In a secret Soviet bunker outside Moscow, alarms suddenly blared to life, warning of incoming nuclear missiles. Imagine the scene. One moment it's calm and quiet, the next a siren is screaming, and a control room panel flashes the word "launch" in urgent red letters. In that instant, a single man faced an excruciating dilemma with only minutes to decide what to do. If the warning was real, the United States had just launched a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. World War III could begin at any moment. If the warning was false, and he acted as if it were real, the Soviets might themselves unleash a nuclear Armageddon by mistake. It was a night charged with panic, confusion, and the weight of the world. And in the midst of it, one relatively unknown Soviet officer had to keep his cool. Little did he know, his split-second judgment in those tense moments would earn him a place in history as the man who saved the world. Welcome to Forgotten History and Hidden Truths, where we uncover incredible true stories that often go untold. Today we're diving into the story of Stanislav Petrov, the unsung hero whose calm decision-making on that fateful night averted a potential nuclear war. It's a story of an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances, a tale that remained hidden for years. Through a compelling chronological narrative, from the global tensions of the Cold War to the quiet life of a retired officer, we'll explore how Petrov's courage and intuition prevented catastrophe. This video will take you through the heart-pounding moments of the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident, build the tension of a world on the brink, and reveal how one man's choice changed history. It's a story with drama, emotion, and a powerful lesson about personal responsibility. So, let's set the stage for one of the most consequential yet little-known episodes of the Cold War. To understand the gravity of Stanislav Petrov's actions, we first need to grasp the hair-trigger atmosphere of the world in 1983. The early 1980s marked one of the most perilous periods of the Cold War. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had escalated to levels many observers believed were as dangerous as, or perhaps even more dangerous than, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was a time when each superpower truly feared the other might launch a surprise nuclear attack, and both sides were preparing for the worst. Let's paint the picture of that tumultuous year. Several events in 1983 drove U.S.-Soviet relations to a boiling point. 1. March 1983. Evil Empire Speech. U.S. President Ronald Reagan publicly denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire. In the same period, he rejected calls for a nuclear freeze, a halt to the arms race, and instead announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars Missile Defense Plan. To Soviet leaders, Reagan's hardline stance and talk of space-based missile shields were deeply alarming. 2nd September 1st, 1983, KAL Flight 007 shot down. Just weeks before our incident, Soviet air defense made a fatal error. They shot down a South Korean passenger plane, Korean Airlines Flight 007, after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people on board. The Soviets suspected it was a U.S. spy plane, but it was actually a civilian airliner off course. This tragedy inflamed East-West tensions and put the Soviet military on high alert, fearing the U.S. might retaliate. 3rd November 1983, NATO's Able Archer exercise. A couple of months later, the NATO alliance ran a large-scale war game called Able Archer 83, simulating nuclear attack procedures. The exercise was unusually realistic, so much so that Soviet intelligence misread it as a possible prelude to an actual nuclear strike. Moscow responded by readying nuclear forces, genuinely afraid that a real attack might be imminent under cover of the exercise. In short, the Soviet leadership was on edge. These episodes created what one historian described as an ongoing war scare, without precedent. Unlike the brief, intense Cuban Missile Crisis, 1983 felt like a rolling crisis that lasted for months. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, a hardline former KGB chief, was reportedly deeply paranoid about the possibility of a U.S. first strike. From Moscow's perspective, the Americans appeared aggressive and unpredictable. Reagan's administration had deployed new missiles in Europe and was probing Soviet defenses with naval exercises. Soviet forces were therefore primed to expect an attack any day, and to respond in minutes if they detected one. And respond they could, with overwhelming force. Both superpowers had built up massive nuclear arsenals by the 1980s. By around 1983, the United States had over 23,000 nuclear warheads in its stockpile, and the Soviet Union had roughly 30,000. There were enough bombs and missiles to wipe out human civilization many times over. Each side kept thousands of warheads on high alert, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Military doctrine on both sides was essentially use them or lose them. If either side believed it was under nuclear attack, it was expected to launch its own missiles before any enemy warheads could land. This strategy, known as mutual assured destruction, meant that a false alarm or technical glitch could potentially trigger a very real nuclear exchange, if not quickly checked by human judgment. This was the reality on the night of September 26, 1983. High stakes and high anxiety defined the era. The Soviet early warning systems were watching U.S. missile fields and vice versa, with each superpower's finger never far from the figurative red button. In this climate of fear and suspicion, a warning of incoming missiles, even a single blip on a radar screen or a computer readout, could set off a chain reaction. Soviet forces had been ordered to respond immediately and with full force to any U.S. nuclear strike. As one U.S. security expert noted, the Soviet Union's entire system in 1983 was geared to expect an attack and to retaliate very quickly. It was on hair-trigger alert. All it might take to ignite Armageddon was one mistaken report of missiles in the air, believed by the men in charge. This was the powder keg situation awaiting Stanislav Petrov as he reported for his overnight shift. The world was on a knife's edge, and nobody realized just how razor-thin the margin of error was, until that error actually happened. Who was the man suddenly thrust into the role of world savior? Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was not a general or high-ranking Kremlin official, but a mid-level officer, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. By all accounts, Petrov was a modest, unassuming figure, a career military man who considered himself a cog in the machine, just doing his duty. Born on September 7, 1939, near Vladivostok in Russia's Far East, he grew up during World War II and its aftermath. His father was a war hero who flew fighter planes against the Nazis. Following in his father's footsteps, at least in part, Stanislav developed an interest in engineering and the military. He attended the Kiev Military Aviation Engineering Academy, where he trained not as a combat officer, but as an engineer. This dual identity, part soldier, part tech specialist, would later prove crucial. By the 1970s, Petrov had joined a new Soviet early warning program that managed satellites meant to detect hostile missile launches. He was essentially a data analyst in uniform, responsible for monitoring computer systems that could alert the Soviet leadership of an incoming nuclear attack. Petrov's job might sound dry, but in the nuclear age, it was a role of immense importance. If World War III were to break out, it could very well start with a warning from the very systems Petrov oversaw. Yet, ironically, despite the high stakes of his work, Petrov was known as a calm and pragmatic man. He wasn't a stereotypical buttoned-up, by-the-book officer. In fact, Petrov later attributed some of his critical thinking to his civilian training. Unlike many of his colleagues who had purely military backgrounds, he had an engineer's mindset and a healthy skepticism of technology. He understood the new satellite-based OKO early warning system inside and out, including its potential flaws. And he knew that in any complex system, malfunctions were possible. This perspective made him a bit more cautious about trusting a computer readout blindly. It's also important to note that Stanislav Petrov wasn't even supposed to be on duty that night. In a twist of fate, he was actually filling in for another officer who fell ill, so he took an extra shift on September 26, 1983. Petrov was 44 years old at the time, with a wife and 2 children at home, though his family had no idea what he actually did at his secret job. As he arrived at the Serpukhov 15 bunker that evening, there was nothing to distinguish it from any other routine night. He settled in for a standard 12-hour overnight watch, expecting uneventful hours of monitoring data streams on the graveyard shift. The Cold War was tense, yes, but there had been no concrete warning of an immediate crisis that day. For Petrov, it was just another day at the office, until shortly after midnight. Little did Lieutenant Colonel Petrov know he was about to face a moment of truth that very few people in history have ever encountered. He was about to confront the ultimate "what do we do" scenario, the kind of split-second decision that could determine the survival of millions. How would you respond if the lives of entire nations were suddenly in your hands? Petrov was about to find out firsthand. Just past midnight, in the early minutes of September 26, 1983, all hell broke loose in the command center. Petrov and his small team sat in the dimly lit bunker, surrounded by screens and panels of blinking lights. For the first few hours of Petrov's shift, nothing out of the ordinary had happened, just the usual quiet vigilance. Then, at around midnight 15 Moscow time, the silence was shattered. A siren began wailing, loud and startling, breaking the quiet like a roar, as Petrov later described. At the same time, a large electronic map on the wall, part of the early warning system, lit up with a single ominous word: launch. Petrov jumped to his feet, heart pounding. I was really taken aback. Holy cow, he recalled, feeling as the alarms screamed. On his computer screen, data coalesced into a chilling conclusion. An intercontinental ballistic missile had apparently been fired from the United States, aimed toward the Soviet Union. The system was reporting with high confidence that a U.S. nuclear warhead was on its way. For a moment, Petrov's training kicked in automatically. Protocol was very clear. If early warning satellites detected a missile launch, the duty officer's task was to immediately pick up the phone and report it up the chain of command. Those warnings would then be relayed all the way to the Soviet General Staff, and ultimately to the Soviet leader, at that time, Yuri Andropov. The top brass might have only minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before the potential incoming missiles hit Soviet soil. In a nuclear scenario, minutes could determine the difference between taking action or losing your own weapons to enemy blasts. Petrov knew this drill well. He had practiced it in simulations. Normally, you don't think twice. You follow the protocol. Every second of delay could be fatal if the attack were real. Yet, almost as soon as it began, Petrov felt something wasn't right. For one thing, the system was indicating just one missile at first. A single nuclear missile launched by the US, by itself? It was an odd scenario. As he gathered his thoughts, the siren sounded again, then again. Within minutes, the computer was now indicating not 1, but 5 US missiles launched in succession. 5 nuclear-tipped ICBMs, streaking over the ocean toward the Soviet Union. Or so the machine said. Picture yourself in that bunker. The lights are flashing. Missile attack now. Your colleagues at the radar screens are pale with shock. Petrov's team looked at him, eyes wide, some verging on panic. This can't be real. Can it? People's voices are probably rising, asking, "What do we do?" Petrov could feel the adrenaline surging through the room. My team was close to panic, he remembered. He knew that if panic sets in, then it's all over. In a state of panic, they might rush into a disastrous decision. He had to keep a clear head. Stanislav Petrov now faced the most consequential decision of his life, and arguably one of the most crucial decisions anyone has ever had to make. The indicators in front of him showed 5 American missiles inbound. The system claimed the warnings were highly reliable. The proper military procedure was to raise the alarm immediately up the chain. Once he did that, events would likely take on a terrifying momentum of their own. Soviet nuclear forces would be placed on full alert. Leadership would scramble into bunkers. Within minutes, they might decide to launch hundreds of their own missiles in retaliation, before any U.S. warheads could land in the USSR. In essence, Petrov's report could trigger a nuclear holocaust. On the other hand, if he chose not to report an attack, and it turned out the attack was real, then the Soviet Union would be struck unprepared, potentially losing millions of lives and much of its own nuclear arsenal in the blasts. It was a devilish catch-22. Report and risk global nuclear war if it's false, or don't report and risk nuclear decimation of your own country if it's true. As Petrov later put it, I realized I had to make some kind of decision, and I was only 50-50 on whether the threat was real. So, how did he decide? Petrov began rapidly reasoning through the scenario in his mind, trying to determine if the alarm was genuine or a glitch. Several crucial factors gave him pause and made him suspect this might be a false alarm instead of the real thing. Too few missiles. Petrov had been trained to expect that if the United States ever launched a nuclear first strike, it would be an overwhelming, all-out attack designed to cripple the Soviet ability to retaliate. The Americans had thousands of warheads. Why would they start a war with just a handful of missiles? 5 ICBMs could do horrific damage to a few cities, yes, but not enough to knock out the Soviet Union's capacity to strike back. It made no strategic sense as a surprise attack. As Petrov later told a reporter, when people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. New, unproven system. The warning was coming from a brand new satellite system, codenamed OKO, that had only been operational for a short time. Petrov knew the system's designers claimed it was foolproof, but as an engineer, he doubted anything could be 100% reliable in its first real deployment. In his view, the system was not yet wholly trustworthy. It might have bugs or blind spots. We built the system to rule out all possibility of false alarms, Petrov later explained, and that day, the satellites told us with the highest degree of certainty that these rockets were on the way. Yet he also knew no system is perfect. Speed of the warning. Petrov noticed that the alert had flashed through all the verification checkpoints extremely quickly, perhaps too quickly. Normally, a warning would be cross-checked by multiple levels of software and human confirmation. The fact that this alert went from detection to high-confidence alarm in almost no time was suspicious. It felt off, as if the system itself might be malfunctioning or misinterpreting data. No secondary confirmation. Crucially, no other sensors or radar had confirmed any incoming missiles. At that time, the Soviet Union's ground-based radars were positioned to detect missiles coming over the horizon, but they would only pick up objects once they were a bit closer to Soviet territory, not immediately at launch. Petrov knew that if this were a real massive attack, within a few minutes the long-range radars should start to see evidence of it. But minutes were passing and the ground radars remained silent. There was no corroboration from any other source, just the satellite system's word. And Petrov recalled that even the satellite data seemed odd. The signal passed through 30 layers of verification, but still might be a fluke of the system. His gut told him to wait just a little longer for more data before sounding Armageddon. All these thoughts raced through Stanislav Petrov's mind in a matter of seconds. He later admitted that he was never absolutely sure the alert was false. Far from it. I was only 50-50, he said of his confidence. In other words, half of him feared this could indeed be the real thing, But he also knew that someone had to make a call, one way or the other, and fast. The responsibility on his shoulders was immense. The responsibility was enormous, Petrov said. The fate of millions he would never meet quite literally hung on what he would do next. With his team looking to him for guidance and the clock ticking, Petrov took a deep breath. He made a decision against his standing orders and training. He would not report the missile launch warnings up the chain. Defying Soviet military protocol, he told his commander that the alarm was likely a false alarm and that the computer was malfunctioning. In effect, Petrov declared the system's big red alert to be a false alarm on his own authority. It was a monumental gamble. If Petrov was wrong and missiles really were incoming, then in a matter of minutes, nuclear explosions would begin devastating Soviet cities with no retaliation launched, meaning Petrov would have failed utterly at his duty. If he was right, however, he would spare the world an apocalyptic miscalculation. In that moment, Petrov later said, he wasn't consciously thinking about saving the world or starting World War III. He was focused on whether the data was trustworthy. Sorry, I didn't have time to think about whether I would be the one who started World War III, he explained. I had to decide how reliable the information was. His engineering skepticism and intuition won out over the panic and the protocol. Petrov informed the higher command that the alarm appeared to be false, essentially urging no retaliation. Then came the agonizing wait. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. By around the 20-minute mark, Petrov and his colleagues realized that no missiles had exploded in Soviet territory. The early warning systems alert had not been followed by the telltale flash of nuclear impacts or any confirmation of inbound missiles on radar. It had indeed been a false alarm. Petrov exhaled in relief as the klaxons stopped. When 20 minutes passed and nothing happened, he later said, I knew I had made the right choice. The Soviet Union was not under attack after all. The immediate crisis passed as abruptly as it had begun. The sirens fell silent, and one by one the warning indicators were withdrawn. You can imagine Petrov and his team slumping in their chairs, drenched in sweat, hands shaking from the adrenaline come-down. The bunker that moments ago felt like the epicenter of Armageddon returned to an eerie calm. Petrov had literally averted disaster by doing nothing, by keeping his head and refusing to push the panic button. In the quiet that followed, he and his fellow officers must have exchanged stunned looks as it sank in how close they had come to the brink. What had happened? Later investigations confirmed that the alarm was triggered by a technical malfunction. Specifically, the Soviet satellite had caught the sun's reflection on the tops of high-altitude clouds above the U.S., which fooled the system's infrared sensors into seeing missile launch plumes. In Petrov's own colorful description, it was as though a child had been playing with a mirror, throwing around the sun's reflection. And by chance, that blinding light landed right in the center of the system's eye. In other words, a quirk of sunlight and cloud geometry had led the computer to report 5 phantom missiles. The new OCO early warning network had a flaw that no one had anticipated, and on this night it reared its head. Fortunately for all of us, Stanislav Petrov suspected as much and trusted his gut when it mattered most. By preventing a false retaliatory strike, Petrov's split-second judgment arguably saved the world from nuclear war. Many experts have since pointed out that had Petrov dutifully passed the alarm upward, the Soviet leadership might well have ordered an immediate counter-launch, given the extreme tensions at the time. They would have likely ordered a retaliatory strike, triggering a nuclear war. The Associated Press later summarized what could have happened. Some analysts caution that Soviet protocol would have required further confirmation, like radar or other satellite data, before actually firing nukes. Officially, both Soviet and American policies demanded multiple sources of warning, not a single alert, to start a war. Indeed, one Russian general later insisted, nobody would have pressed the button, nobody would have launched anything based on that information alone. However, others strongly disagree. noting how razor-thin the decision time was and how paranoid the atmosphere had become. As nuclear security scholar Bruce Blair explained, by late 1983, the Soviet system was so nervous that a false alarm at that moment could not have come at a more dangerous, intense phase in U.S.-Soviet relations. With only minutes to react and a belief that America might strike first, it is frighteningly plausible that Soviet leaders, if told missiles were on the way, would have launched a full counterattack immediately, even if standard procedure called for waiting until actual nuclear explosions were detected. In the fog of crisis, mistakes and impulsive decisions can happen. We'll never know for certain, because thankfully the scenario was never tested, thanks to Petrov's courage. What we do know is that in those tense minutes, the world's fate hinged on the judgment of one man, and that man chose to trust human reason over an unreliable machine. As Petrov later humbly put it, "I was just doing my job." But as we'll see, the world would later recognize that on that night, Petrov's job was nothing less than stopping World War III. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Stanislav Petrov was shaken but likely feeling vindicated that he had made the right call. However, his long night was not over. Having declared a false alarm and averted a crisis, Petrov now had to answer to his superiors. Within hours, he was subjected to intense debriefing and questioning by Soviet officers up the chain. How had this happened? How had the shiny new early warning system failed so spectacularly? And why did Petrov act contrary to his instructions? Initially, there was some acknowledgement that Petrov had acted correctly. In fact, the commander of Soviet air defense's missile defense units at the time, General Yuri Votintsev, later revealed that Petrov's correct actions were noted and that he personally praised Petrov for his decision. Petrov recalls that in the immediate debrief, some of his higher-ups quietly congratulated him and even promised a reward for averting disaster. It's not hard to imagine why a few sensible commanders might have been grateful. After all, Petrov may have saved their lives and families too. But the Soviet military bureaucracy was not going to celebrate an incident that exposed serious flaws in their prized system. Publicly rewarding Petrov would mean admitting that the early warning system had failed, a huge embarrassment to both the Soviet military and the scientists who developed it. The KGB and the generals were not about to broadcast that their state-of-the-art missile detection network could be triggered by sunlight bouncing off clouds. So the official reaction quickly shifted from praise to silence and even mild censure. Petrov was reprimanded for a minor detail. Supposedly, he had made an error in his logbook during the incident. He later quipped that when they scolded him for not filling out the war diary in the heat of the moment, he answered, "Because I had a phone in one hand and the intercom in the other, and I don't have a third hand." The brass was clearly looking for any excuse to avoid highlighting Petrov's role. In the end, he says, "I was neither punished nor rewarded." Essentially, they swept it under the rug. Not only did Petrov not receive any honors at that time, but his once promising career stalled. He was quietly reassigned to a less sensitive post, effectively sidelined from important work. Feeling alienated and under tremendous stress, Petrov suffered a nervous breakdown not long after. By 1984, less than a year after the incident, he took early retirement from the military. Petrov was only in his mid-40s, but his military days were over. The weight of what happened and the lack of support afterward had taken a heavy toll. Meanwhile, the Soviet government clamped down on any information about the false alarm. The entire episode was classified and kept secret for over a decade. To the outside world, and even to most of Petrov's fellow officers, nothing notable had occurred that night. The world kept spinning, oblivious to how close it had come to nuclear war. In the Soviet Union, only a handful of insiders knew a man named Petrov had stood between peace and annihilation in September 1983, and none of them were talking. Petrov himself went on with life as a retiree. He lived a quiet life thereafter, taking a job at the research institute that had designed the early warning system, the irony, and later caring for his wife, Raisa, during her illness, until she sadly passed away from cancer in 1997. By the 1990s, Stanislav Petrov was an anonymous civilian living in a modest apartment outside Moscow, reportedly growing potatoes on his balcony to make ends meet, his pivotal act largely unknown. It wasn't until after the collapse of the Soviet Union that the truth finally emerged. In 1991, as the USSR disintegrated, General Votintsev, the same commander who had first heard Petrov's report in 1983, decided to speak up about the incident. A few details leaked out in the early 90s, but the story still didn't gain wide attention. Only in 1998, when Votintsev published his memoirs, did the Petrov incident become public knowledge in a substantial way. Widespread media reports started to appear, highlighting how one mid-level officer's decision had averted a potential cataclysm. The Western press, in particular, seized on the narrative, and Stanislav Petrov was soon being hailed as the man who saved the world. Petrov himself was a bit bewildered by the attention. He had assumed the night's events were forgotten. If Colonel General Yuri Votintsev had not spoken out, I would have forgotten about it like a bad dream, Petrov admitted later. He had tried to put that scary night out of his mind until the world came knocking on his door wanting to hear the story. When the story of Stanislav Petrov's 1983 decision finally became known, it captured imaginations around the globe. Here was a real hero narrative that felt like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, except it had actually happened. Petrov, now in the late 1990s, was surprised to find himself famous in certain circles outside Russia, even as he remained relatively unknown at home. Journalists and organizations began reaching out to interview him and honor him for his actions. In the 2000s, belated recognition started trickling in. In May 2004, Petrov was awarded the World Citizen Award by the San Francisco-based Association of World Citizens, which commended the part he played in averting a catastrophe. They even gave him a trophy and $1,000, a small token for saving perhaps millions of lives, but a token nonetheless. In January 2006, Petrov traveled to New York City, his first trip to the United States, where he was honored at the United Nations. There, he received a second World Citizen Award and stood in the UN headquarters as officials applauded this humble former Soviet officer who had helped save the planet. Petrov also had the chance on that trip to meet famous American news anchor Walter Cronkite, who interviewed him about that fateful night. One can only imagine Petrov's astonishment. A quiet pensioner from Moscow's suburbs, suddenly shaking hands with renowned Western figures and being toasted as a hero. Recognition kept coming. Petrov received Germany's Media Prize in 2011, an award typically given to statesmen and public figures. He stood on stage with a bemused look as flashbulbs went off, a far cry from his secret bunker days. In 2013, he was awarded the Dresden Peace Prize in Germany, again honoring his role in preventing nuclear war. Despite these honors, Petrov remained the same modest person. He often insisted he didn't do anything heroic. He was doing his work, and he never considered himself a hero, his son Dmitry said. He was simply doing his job, that's all. In 2014, Petrov's story hit the silver screen in a documentary drama film titled The Man Who Saved the World. This Danish-produced film interwove reenactments of the 1983 incident with footage of the real Petrov in his later years. The filmmakers even brought Petrov to the U.S. and had him meet Hollywood actors like Kevin Costner, Matt Damon, and Robert De Niro as a kind of playful tribute. It's quite touching in the film. You see Petrov, a bit shy and gruff, receiving a standing ovation at the United Nations, then chatting awkwardly with American movie stars who treat him with awe, as if he were the celebrity. But back home in Russia, it was a different story. In Petrov's homeland, his name never became widely known or officially celebrated. He continued living in the same small apartment in Friazino, a Moscow suburb, in rather humble conditions. A journalist who visited noted the place was simple and even a bit unkempt, exactly as depicted in the documentary. Petrov wasn't given any formal state award or recognition by the Russian government, which remained largely silent on his role. To the end of his life, he was a forgotten figure in Russia, known to history buffs around the world, but not to the average Russian on the street. Petrov, for his part, did not seek fame. He even grew irritated at times with journalists intruding on his quiet life, though he remained gracious, often inviting them into his kitchen for tea. He maintained that anyone in his position should have done what he did, though privately he acknowledged that not everyone might have had the composure to do so. Perhaps the most poignant moment came toward the end of Petrov's life. On May 19, 2017, Stanislav Petrov passed away in his apartment at age 77. Fittingly, his death was quiet and unheralded. In fact, it went unnoticed for months. There were no official announcements in Russia. The world only learned Petrov had died when his German friend, Karl Schumacher, called in September 2017 to wish him a happy birthday, and Petrov's son Dmitry answered to say Stanislav had died some time ago. Schumacher, who had long been an advocate of Petrov's story, alerted the media and lamented that it was important to let the world know of Petrov's passing because we owe this man a lot. The Russian state media eventually ran a brief notice, but no high officials commented. Petrov's departure was as unsung as much of his life. Yet, thanks to storytellers and historians, his legacy lives on globally. Stanislav Petrov in later years, at home in Russia. This photo shows Petrov in his modest apartment, wearing his old uniform adorned with medals, a quiet reminder of his service. Despite international accolades late in life, Petrov received little official recognition in his homeland and lived out his days in relative obscurity. He remained humble about his role, often stating he wasn't a hero and that he was simply in the right place at the right time. It's profoundly sobering to reflect that the world continued as normal on September 27, 1983, largely unaware of how close we all came to nuclear annihilation the day before. The incident was a non-event to the public. Nothing happened after all. People went to work, kids went to school, the news was full of other stories. Only decades later did we realize that on that autumn night, a few small choices by one man made the difference between life and death on a massive scale. As Petrov's son Dmitry put it, the world literally was hanging by a strand of hair at that moment. Stanislav Petrov's story is more than just a dramatic anecdote from the Cold War. It carries powerful lessons and a legacy that remains highly relevant today. In an era when technology and automation are even more prevalent in military systems, Petrov's actions underscore the indispensable value of human judgment and moral courage. He famously trusted his intuition over a computer, preventing a catastrophe that cold logic and protocol might have triggered. This is often cited as an example of how machines, no matter how advanced, can fail in unexpected ways, and how critical it is to have thoughtful humans in the loop who can say, "Wait, let's double-check this." His decision demonstrated that doubt and caution can be virtues, in stark contrast to the usual portrayal of decisive military heroes who charge ahead. In Petrov's case, choosing not to act rashly was the heroic deed. Petrov's experience also serves as a grim reminder of just how precarious global security can be. The Cold War may have ended, but the world still has thousands of nuclear weapons on alert, and false alarms have occurred on both the US and Russian sides over the years. In fact, incidents like the one Petrov managed have happened several times. Earlier in the Cold War, the United States experienced glitches such as faulty computer chips and simulation tapes mistakenly indicating Soviet attacks, which fortunately were recognized in time. Even in 1995, after the Soviet collapse, Russia's early warning radars mischaracterized a Norwegian scientific rocket launch as a possible missile attack, nearly leading President Yeltsin to consider pressing the button before the confusion was cleared up. Each close call reminds us how we've been living on the edge of potential disaster, often without the public realizing it. The 1983 Soviet false alarm incident, as it's dryly labeled in declassified files, could have gone down in history books in a far more tragic way. Instead, it has a kind of heroic silver lining. It gives us one example in which things went right under pressure. It has even been described with only slight hyperbole as the single most significant moment of the Cold War because of what was at stake and how a catastrophe was averted. Petrov's restraint and level-headedness are now taught in international relations courses and ethics classes as a case study. What do you do when you have to make a decision with incomplete information that could end the world? Petrov's answer was, you pause, use reason, and refuse to be rushed by fear. Of course, there are those who debate how much credit Petrov deserves. As we discussed, some Soviet military officials later argued that even if Petrov had reported the alert, standard procedures would have prevented immediate nuclear launch without corroborating evidence. In their view, perhaps the world wasn't entirely at risk because checks and balances existed. But other analysts, and certainly the weight of historical opinion, lean towards the notion that Petrov's choice was indeed pivotal, especially given the context of 1983's war scare. The truth probably lies in between. Petrov may not have had a literal red button to launch missiles himself. He did not. He was a warning officer, not a launch officer, but his report was a crucial input into the Soviet decision-making chain. Had that input been, "We are under attack," the subsequent steps could have escalated uncontrollably in those fraught moments. So yes, Petrov's cool head saved the day, even if indirectly. As one scholar put it, in that rigid Soviet hierarchy, having the courage and guts to go against the computer took a special kind of character. Today, Stanislav Petrov's name stands alongside a few other unsung heroes of the nuclear age. People often mention individuals like Vasily Arkhipov, the Soviet Navy officer who in 1962 refused to consent to a submarine captain's launch of a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis, thus also arguably saving the world. Or Olga Misik, a Soviet colonel who in 1983, just weeks before Petrov's incident, helped defuse a tense situation when NATO's Able Archer exercise panicked Moscow. These stories remind us that throughout history, there have been critical moments where one person's moral compass and level head prevented disaster. They weren't presidents or generals, just individuals in the right or wrong place at a critical time, who found the courage to say no or wait when it mattered. Stanislav Petrov's story has a motivational undertone as well. It shows that one ordinary person truly can make an extraordinary difference. Petrov didn't have superpowers, special resources, or a grand title. He was, by his own admission, in the right place at the right time. Many of us might feel that in a colossal crisis, only leaders or celebrities or powerful people have agency. But here, a middle-ranking officer, unknown to the world, made a choice that arguably saved everyone. It's a humbling and inspiring thought. The next time you feel like your actions can't possibly matter on a global scale, remember Stanislav Petrov. History's unspoken heroes often don't set out to be heroes at all. They simply do what they feel is right, sometimes under incredible pressure, and the ripple effects of those actions can be immense. Perhaps the final lesson is one of humility and vigilance. Petrov's saga encourages governments and citizens alike to ensure that human values aren't lost in our high-tech defense apparatus. No matter how advanced our systems become, we must never place blind faith in them over human judgment. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, we need people of integrity at every level, ready to make wise decisions in split seconds. It is scary to think our world might depend on such moments, But as Petrov's tale shows, it has before, and likely will again. On that night in 1983, Stanislav Petrov was a man alone at a blinking console, burdened with a decision none of us would envy. By staying calm and thinking for himself, he averted a horror beyond imagining. Petrov received modest accolades later in life, but in a perfect world, his name would be up there with the great peacemakers, because in a very real sense, he allowed peace to continue. The next time you wake up to a normal day, consider that you might owe that very normalcy to a quiet hero who, decades ago, saved the world by doing the right thing when it counted most. Thank you for joining us in exploring this incredible true story of a forgotten hero. If Stanislav Petrov's bravery and level-headedness inspired you, please give this video a thumbs up. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Had you heard of this story before? What would you have done in Petrov's position? Let us know in the comments below. Your insights and reactions are important to us. And if you enjoyed dives into hidden histories and unsung heroes like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Remember, sometimes the fate of the world can hinge on one person making the right call. Stay curious, stay hopeful, and until next time, thanks for watching.